I never thought it would break me like this. 48 moments of disrespect from my own daughter-in-law, each one a stab sharper than the last. The worst part? They never even knew I won $28 million in the lottery because I stopped trusting them long before I could tell. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 73 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. I was wrong. So terribly, devastatingly wrong. The morning light filters through my small Queens apartment window, casting long shadows across furniture that has held decades of memories. The scent of coffee mingles with the faint aroma of roses from my windowsill garden, but even these simple pleasures feel hollow now. The subway rumbles beneath my building, a constant reminder of the bustling life outside while I sit here, surrounded by silence that wasn't supposed to define my golden years. I used to wake up with purpose. Phone calls to make, grandchildren to spoil, family dinners to plan. Now I wake up to emptiness. The worn wooden floors creak under my feet as I shuffle to the kitchen, past photographs that once brought joy but now feel like monuments to a past I can't reclaim. There's my son David at his graduation, beaming with pride. There's his wedding day when I thought I was gaining a daughter. The irony tastes bitter on my tongue now. The text message arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. It was from my daughter-in-law Sarah, brief and cutting as always. Eleanor, we need to talk about your attitude problem. You're making everyone uncomfortable at family gatherings. My hands trembled as I read those words. Attitude problem? I stared at the screen until the letters blurred through my tears. This was moment number 48, though I hadn't been counting then. I only started counting later, when the pain became too much to ignore. You see, I had been keeping track in a small notebook, writing down each slight, each cruel comment, each moment when I felt invisible in my own family. It started as a way to remember, to make sense of the confusion in my mind. Was I imagining things? Was I really becoming the bitter old woman they seemed to think I was? The notebook held 47 previous entries, spanning 2 years of gradual erosion of my dignity, my place in the family I had sacrificed everything to build. Let me take you back to where it all began, to help you understand how we got here. How a woman who once commanded respect in her neighborhood, who raised a son alone in the gritty streets of Queens, who worked 3 jobs to put him through college, became a burden in her own family's eyes. It was 1975 when my husband left. David was only 8 years old, clutching his baseball glove and asking when Daddy was coming home. I didn't have the heart to tell him that Daddy wasn't coming home, that Daddy had found someone younger, someone without stretch marks and tired eyes. Instead, I held my boy close and made a promise that would shape the next 40 years of my life. I would be everything to him, mother and father, provider and protector, cheerleader and disciplinarian. The early morning shift at the diner started at 5 a.m. I'd kiss David's sleeping forehead and tiptoe out into the pre-dawn darkness of Queens, my breath creating small clouds in the winter air. The smell of bacon grease would cling to my uniform. My feet would ache in shoes that were 2 years past replacement, but I endured because every dollar went toward David's future. After the diner, I'd rush to my afternoon job at the department store, folding clothes and smiling at customers who looked right through me. Evenings were for cleaning office buildings in Manhattan, riding the subway back to Queens with my feet swollen and my back screaming. David thrived. Honor roll every semester, captain of the debate team, full scholarship to Columbia University. I sat in that graduation audience with tears streaming down my face, wearing the one good dress I owned, knowing that every sacrifice had been worth it. When he met Sarah during his junior year, my heart swelled with happiness. She was beautiful, ambitious, everything I had ever hoped for in a daughter-in-law. I welcomed her with open arms, blind to the subtle ways she began to chip away at my relationship with my son. The first signs were small. Comments about my outdated ways of cooking, suggestions that I might be more comfortable staying home instead of joining them for dinner with their friends. Sarah had a way of smiling while she delivered these little cuts, her voice sweet as honey, while the words stung like poison. David would laugh nervously and change the subject, but I noticed. Oh, how I noticed. When they married in 2010, I paid for the flowers. $15,000 from my retirement savings, money I had scraped together working double shifts well into my 60s. Sarah never thanked me directly. Instead, she told everyone how blessed they were that David's family could contribute. Contribute. As if my life savings were a minor donation rather than the culmination of decades of sacrifice. The grandchildren arrived 2 years later. Twins, Emma and Michael. Perfect little beings who brought light back into my world. I babysat every weekend, changed countless diapers, walked them through their first steps, taught them to say grandma before they could say mama. Sarah worked part-time at a boutique while David established his law practice, and I was their reliable backup. The unpaid nanny who never complained, never asked for anything in return except the joy of being needed. But that joy began to sour as the children grew and Sarah's comments became more frequent, more pointed. Eleanor, we appreciate your help, but the children need consistency in their routines. Eleanor, I wish you would ask before buying them toys. Eleanor, perhaps you could update your childcare methods to something more modern. Each comment delivered with that same sweet smile. Each one designed to make me feel small, outdated, unnecessary. The financial requests started gradually. A loan to help with the down payment on their house in Astoria. Another loan when David's practice hit a rough patch. Money for the children's private school, for violin lessons, for summer camps. I gave freely, dipping deeper and deeper into my savings, telling myself that this was what family did. This was love in action. But love, I learned, is not supposed to be one-sided. Love is not supposed to leave you empty and questioning your worth. Love is not supposed to come with conditions and criticisms and the constant fear that you're one misstep away from being discarded. The 48 moments of disrespect that I documented in that notebook weren't dramatic scenes from a movie. They were everyday cruelties, small paper cuts that eventually bled me dry. Like the time Sarah told her friends at Emma's birthday party that I was well-meaning but interfering, while I stood 3 feet away helping serve the cake I had paid for. Or when she hired a babysitter for the children instead of calling me, explaining to David that they needed professional childcare for such an important evening. There was the Mother's Day when they forgot to call. The Christmas when they opened gifts from Sarah's parents first, mine last with less enthusiasm. The countless family photos I was not included in because Sarah wanted just the nuclear family for their holiday cards. The conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The eye rolls when I shared stories from my past. The subtle repositioning at family gatherings so I sat furthest from the center of attention. Each incident might have been forgiven in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of systematic exclusion, a deliberate campaign to minimize my importance in my own family's life. I began to feel like a stranger in my son's home, an unwelcome guest at gatherings I helped fund. The woman who had given everything to build this family was being politely but persistently pushed to its margins. But let me tell you about the moment everything changed. The moment when 48 became the final number in my notebook, because I stopped accepting their treatment and started counting my own worth instead. It was a rainy Thursday in March when I decided to buy that lottery ticket. I had been grocery shopping at the bodega on Northern Boulevard, the same place I'd shopped for 30 years. Miguel, the owner, always asked about David and the grandchildren. Always remembered my birthday. Always treated me with the respect that seemed to have vanished from my own family. That day, something compelled me to buy a Mega Millions ticket. $28. I remember the exact amount because it seemed significant somehow. A small rebellion against all the time Sarah had commented on my wasteful spending. I tucked the ticket into my wallet and forgot about it for 3 days. On Sunday night, while eating dinner alone in front of the television, the lottery drawing began. I almost changed the channel. I had never been one to chase impossible dreams, but something made me dig through my purse for that crumpled ticket. The first number matched, then the second. My heart began to race. Third number, fourth, fifth. The mega ball. Every single number on my ticket matched the numbers being called on television. $28 million. 28 million reasons to never feel powerless again. I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, checking and rechecking those numbers until they blurred together. The ticket felt both weightless and impossibly heavy in my hands. This was my independence, my security, my freedom from the subtle tyranny of conditional love. This was my chance to rewrite the story of my twilight years. But here's what struck me most in that moment of life-changing fortune. My first thought wasn't excitement or joy. It was relief. Relief that I would never again have to tolerate disrespect in exchange for belonging. Relief that I could love my family without needing their approval. Relief that my worth was no longer tied to my usefulness. I decided that night not to tell them immediately. I wanted to observe, to see if their behavior toward me was truly conditional on what I could provide. I had accumulated enough evidence of their treatment. Now I would conduct a final experiment in my own value. The next morning, David called with a request that had become routine. Mom, we need help with the mortgage payment this month. Sarah's hours were cut at the boutique and were a little short. $1,500. The same amount I'd been providing monthly for the past year to keep their household afloat. I had never missed a payment, never questioned the necessity, never asked for accountability on how the money was spent. I'm sorry, David. I heard myself saying, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I can't help this month. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough for me to question my decision. Was I being cruel? Was I testing them unfairly? His response erased all doubt. Mom, what's gotten into you? We're counting on you. We've built our budget around your help. Not concern for my well-being, not curiosity about why my financial situation might have changed, just irritation that their reliable source of funding had developed an inconvenient opinion. I understand you're counting on me, I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. But I need to prioritize my own financial security right now. It was the first time in decades I had put my needs before theirs, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The conversation ended awkwardly with David promising to figure something out and me promising to help when I could. But I knew something fundamental had shifted. I had broken the unspoken contract that kept our relationship functioning, my unconditional support in exchange for their conditional acceptance. Sarah called 2 hours later, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Eleanor, I don't know what David told you, but we really need that money. The mortgage company isn't going to accept excuses, and we can't afford to damage our credit. Still no concern for me. No acknowledgement that I might have needs of my own, just the assumption that I existed to solve their problems. Sarah, I understand this is difficult, I began, choosing my words carefully. But I've been helping for over a year now. Perhaps it's time to look at other solutions. The suggestion that they take responsibility for their own financial planning was apparently radical enough to render her speechless for several seconds. Other solutions? She repeated, her voice rising. Eleanor, we've arranged our entire life around this help. You can't just pull the rug out from under us without warning. The entitlement in her tone was stunning. My life savings had become their safety net, and any attempt to reclaim control over my own resources was treated as a betrayal. I'm not pulling any rug, I said, feeling the first stirrings of real anger. I'm an elderly woman on a fixed income who needs to be careful with her finances. Surely you can understand that. But of course she couldn't understand that, because she had never been asked to understand that. For years, I had buffered them from the reality of my limitations, sacrificing my security for their comfort. That phone call ended with Sarah's thinly veiled threat. Well, I hope you realize this affects the whole family, Eleanor. The children are going to be very disappointed if we have to cut back on their activities. Using my grandchildren as emotional leverage, making my financial boundaries seem like an attack on innocent victims rather than a necessary act of self-preservation. I spent that evening walking through Astoria Park, watching the East River flow past the city lights. The lottery ticket sat in my purse like a secret weapon. 28 million reasons why I never had to accept another guilt trip, another manipulation, another moment of being made to feel small. But I also understood that revealing my windfall would change everything, and not necessarily for the better. Money has a way of bringing out the worst in people, and I had already seen enough of my family's worst to last a lifetime. Instead, I decided to test their capacity for treating me with basic human dignity when I offered nothing in return. The results of that test would determine whether they deserved to know about the fortune that could transform all our lives. Over the following weeks, I maintained my boundary around financial support. David's calls became less frequent and more strained. Sarah stopped including me in family photos and casual invitations. The grandchildren's visits became orchestrated affairs, clearly mandated by guilty parents rather than genuine desire for my company. I was being systematically excluded from the family I had spent my life building, punished for the crime of having my own needs. The breaking point came at Emma's 9th birthday party in June. I had been invited, nominally, but made to feel unwelcome from the moment I arrived. Sarah's parents were there, treated like honored guests, consulted on every decision, praised for every contribution. I sat in a corner chair, watching my granddaughter's celebration unfold around me like I was viewing it through glass. When it came time to open presents, Emma tore through Sarah's parents' elaborate gifts with enthusiasm and gratitude. Their expensive dollhouse and art set were received with squeals of delight and generous hugs. My gift, a handmade photo album filled with pictures of Emma and me from her earliest years, was opened last and acknowledged with a polite thank you before being set aside for more exciting offerings. But it was Sarah's comment to her mother that shattered something inside me. As they cleaned up wrapping paper, I heard her say, "It's so nice when grandparents actually put thought and money into gifts instead of just showing up with homemade crafts." She glanced in my direction to ensure I heard, that sweet smile firmly in place. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood staring at my reflection in their guest mirror, seeing a woman I barely recognized. When had I become so diminished? When had I accepted being treated like a charity case in my own son's home? When had my love become something to be endured rather than cherished? That night, I did something I hadn't done since those early days of single motherhood. I made a plan to reclaim my life. The first step was establishing boundaries that couldn't be crossed, regardless of the emotional manipulation that would surely follow. I called a family meeting for the following Sunday, inviting David, Sarah, and the children to my apartment for dinner. It would be the last time I would host them as the grateful, diminished version of myself they had grown comfortable dismissing. I spent days preparing for that conversation, rehearsing words I had never imagined needing to say to my own family. The lottery ticket sat in my jewelry box, my secret ace in the hole if they pushed too far. But I hoped, desperately hoped, that I wouldn't need to play that card. I hoped that somehow they would hear me and choose love over convenience, relationship over transaction. Sunday arrived gray and humid, typical for a July afternoon in Queens. I prepared David's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, the same recipe I had perfected during his childhood. The apartment felt smaller with all of them there, Sarah's presence somehow filling more space than the children and David combined. Emma and Michael played quietly in my living room while the adults gathered around my small dining table. "I've asked you all here because we need to discuss some changes in our family dynamic," I began, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. Sarah's eyebrows rose in what looked like amusement rather than concern. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, if this is about the money again, we've already talked about finding other options," David said quickly, as if eager to end the conversation before it began. He had lost weight since our financial arrangement ended, stress eating away at his formerly robust frame. Part of me ached to see him struggling, but a larger part recognized that his stress came from entitlement, not genuine hardship. "This isn't just about money, David," I continued, looking at each of them in turn. "This is about respect. This is about how I've been treated in this family for the past several years." Sarah's expression had shifted from amusement to annoyance, clearly irritated that her evening was being consumed by what she undoubtedly saw as an elderly woman's complaints. "Eleanor, I think you might be overthinking some casual comments," Sarah interjected, her tone patronizing in the way that had become so familiar. "Everyone in the family loves you. We're just busy with our own lives and sometimes things come out wrong." The dismissal was immediate and complete, my concerns reduced to oversensitivity and misunderstanding. I reached for the notebook I had kept hidden for 2 years, placing it on the table between us. "I've been documenting incidents for 24 months, I said quietly. 48 specific moments when I felt disrespected, dismissed, or devalued in this family. The notebook seemed to pulse with significance in the sudden silence. David's face had gone pale. "Mom, you've been keeping a list of our conversations? That seems a little extreme. Even now, even faced with concrete evidence of patterns that had wounded me repeatedly, his instinct was to question my methods rather than examine their behavior. Let me share just a few examples," I said, opening the notebook to a random page. March 15th, Sarah tells me the children need more sophisticated childcare for date nights. April 2nd, David suggests I might be more comfortable staying home instead of attending Michael's soccer game. April 27th, Sarah refers to my financial help as contributions when introducing me to her book club friends. Each entry I read aloud landed like a small bomb in the room, creating ripples of discomfort and defensive posturing. Sarah's response was swift and predictable. "Eleanor, if you've been this unhappy with our relationship, maybe you should have spoken up sooner instead of keeping some kind of secret diary." The blame transferred back to me, my documentation of their behavior somehow more problematic than the behavior itself. "I'm speaking up now," I replied, closing the notebook but keeping my hand resting on its cover. "I'm asking for basic courtesy and inclusion in the family I helped build. I'm asking to be treated like a person with feelings rather than a convenience to be utilized when needed and ignored otherwise." The room fell silent except for the children's laughter drifting in from the living room. Emma and Michael, blessedly unaware of the adult drama unfolding, continued their innocent play while their parents grappled with uncomfortable truths about their treatment of their grandmother. "What exactly do you want from us?" David asked finally, his voice carrying a mix of guilt and resentment. This was the question I had been preparing for, the moment when I would either rebuild our relationships on better foundations or accept that they were irreparable. "I want to be included in family decisions that affect me. I want my contributions acknowledged rather than dismissed. I want conversations with me, not just requests for favors. I want my granddaughter's birthday gifts to be received with the same enthusiasm as other grandparents. I want to stop feeling like I have to earn my place in this family through constant giving." The words poured out of me, years of suppressed needs finally given voice. Sarah's reaction was immediate and harsh. "This is emotional blackmail, Eleanor. You're trying to make us feel guilty for living our own lives instead of revolving everything around your feelings." The accusation stung, particularly because it revealed how thoroughly she misunderstood my request for basic human dignity. "Sarah, asking to be treated with respect isn't emotional blackmail," I responded, feeling anger rise in my chest for the first time in this conversation. Expecting gratitude for years of financial and practical support isn't unreasonable. Wanting to feel valued in my own son's family isn't asking for the world to revolve around me. David looked torn, glancing between his wife and his mother, caught in a conflict that shouldn't have existed if they had been treating me appropriately all along. "Mom, we do value you. Maybe we've been taking you for granted, but that doesn't mean we don't love you." "Love without respect is just a pretty word, David," I said, surprised by my own clarity. "Love without consideration is just convenience. Love without reciprocity is just exploitation." The harsh truths hung in the air between us, too substantial to be dismissed with easy reassurances. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't think I need to sit here and be lectured about love by someone who's been secretly documenting our private conversations. This is manipulative behavior, Eleanor, and I won't tolerate it." She began gathering her purse and calling for the children, ready to storm out rather than engage with the uncomfortable reality of her treatment of me. This was my moment. The moment when I could reveal the $28 million sitting in my bank account and watch their entire attitude transform instantly. I could see the calculation in their sudden concern for my feelings, the desperate backtracking as they realized they had been alienating someone with the power to transform their financial reality. I could buy their respect and watch them pretend their previous behavior had been a misunderstanding. Instead, I let them leave. I watched from my apartment window as they loaded into their car, Sarah's angry gestures visible even from 5 stories up. David looked back at my building once before driving away, his expression unreadable in the distance. The children pressed their faces to the rear window, Emma waving up at what she hoped was my silhouette. That night, I sat with my lottery ticket and my notebook, 2 documents that represented different paths forward. One offered the power to command respect through financial leverage. The other offered the honesty to demand respect through human dignity. I chose dignity. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans for testing my resolve. The phone call started the next morning. David, apologetic and concerned, wanting to work things out and find better ways to communicate. Sarah, surprisingly, called too, her tone carefully modulated to suggest she had been misunderstood rather than confrontational. They had clearly discussed strategy overnight, recognizing that they had pushed too far and needed to repair the relationship quickly. What they didn't know was that their sudden interest in reconciliation only confirmed my worst fears about the conditional nature of their love. They weren't calling because they had gained insight into their behavior or because they genuinely cared about my feelings. They were calling because they needed their financial safety net back in place. Over the following days, I received a parade of peace offerings, flowers from Sarah with a note about clearing the air, an invitation to dinner from David emphasizing how much the children missed me, text messages with photos of Emma and Michael asking when Grandma was coming to visit. Each gesture felt calculated rather than genuine, designed to restore the status quo rather than address the underlying problems. I responded politely but remained firm in my boundaries. Yes, I would love to see the grandchildren, but family visits would need to be based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Yes, I wanted to maintain our relationship, but our financial arrangement would not resume. Yes, I loved them, but love required reciprocal consideration to flourish. The charming phase of their campaign lasted exactly 2 weeks before the guilt trips resumed in earnest. Sarah's mother had apparently been recruited to call me, expressing concern about the strain I was putting on David's marriage by being inflexible about family finances. David himself began dropping hints about potential consequences. Maybe they would need to move farther away to find affordable housing, making visits with the grandchildren more difficult. Each manipulation attempt strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Were these really the people I had sacrificed my entire life to support? Were these the family members I had enabled to treat me as expendable? The lottery ticket in my jewelry box represented more than financial security. It represented the power to walk away from relationships that diminished rather than enriched my life. 3 weeks after our family meeting, a new crisis emerged that would test both their character and my resolve in ways I never anticipated. David called on a Thursday evening, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic. Sarah had been in a car accident. Nothing serious, but their insurance had lapsed due to financial pressures, and they were facing significant medical bills and car repairs. "Mom, I know things have been tense between us, but we really need help," he said, and for the first time in months, I heard the vulnerable child I had once comforted through nightmares and disappointments. "Sarah's okay, but we're looking at maybe $15,000 in expenses, and I don't know where else to turn." This was the test I had been dreading, a genuine emergency that required financial resources they didn't have, presented to someone they had systematically alienated until they needed something. If I refused to help, was I being principled or cruel? If I agreed to help, was I being compassionate or enabling their continued disrespect? I spent that night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a decision that felt impossible, regardless of which direction I chose. The practical part of me recognized that $15,000 was a trivial amount compared to my lottery winnings. The emotional part of me wondered if I was using their crisis to punish them for years of poor treatment. The wise part of me understood that this moment would define our relationship forever, one way or another. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called David back and agreed to help with the medical bills and car repairs, but with conditions that had never existed before. The money would be a loan, with formal documentation and a repayment schedule. I would need to see the actual bills and invoices rather than simply writing a check. And most importantly, my financial assistance would not restore our previous arrangement. This was emergency help, not a return to ongoing support. David's relief was palpable and immediate. "Mom, thank you so much. You have no idea how worried we've been. I promise we'll pay you back as soon as we can get back on our feet." For a moment, I heard genuine gratitude without calculation, authentic appreciation without manipulation. It reminded me of why I had loved this family enough to sacrifice for them in the first place. But Sarah's response when she called later that day revealed the true nature of their crisis management. "Eleanor, I really appreciate you helping us through this emergency. David told me about the loan paperwork, but I hope you realize that families shouldn't treat each other like a bank. We'll pay you back, of course, but all the formal documentation seems a little cold." Even in accepting my help, she was positioning my boundaries as somehow inappropriate, my need for basic accountability as a sign of mistrust rather than learned wisdom. "Sarah, I want to help you during this crisis," I replied carefully. "But our previous financial arrangement caused problems in our relationship that I'm not interested in repeating. The documentation protects both of us by making expectations clear." I was learning to explain my boundaries without defending them, to state my needs without negotiating them away. The loan was processed within a week, with David signing paperwork that probably felt humiliating but necessary. I paid the medical bills directly to the hospital and the car repair costs directly to the garage, ensuring that my money actually addressed the emergency rather than disappearing into their general budget. For the first time in our financial relationship, I maintained oversight of how my support was used. What happened next shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow it did. Within 2 weeks of receiving my help, Sarah was posting on social media about a weekend trip to the Hamptons with friends. David had purchased a new guitar, something he'd been wanting for months. The children had new designer clothes that appeared in family photos. Meanwhile, my loan sat untouched in terms of repayment planning, apparently forgotten as soon as the crisis passed. When I called to ask about their repayment timeline, David sounded annoyed rather than grateful. "Mom, we just got through this emergency. It's going to take some time to get our finances straightened out before we can start paying you back." The entitlement had returned as quickly as it had disappeared, my assistance once again taken for granted, and my concerns treated as unreasonable pressure. This time, however, I had documentation. A signed loan agreement, canceled checks, proof of how quickly they had returned to unnecessary spending while avoiding their obligations to me. I also had something they didn't know about: the financial resources to never need their repayment, and the emotional clarity to recognize what their behavior revealed about their character. I sat in my apartment that evening, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange ways life tests our values. The lottery ticket had given me the power to solve their problems without sacrifice, but it had also given me the clarity to see that solving their problems wouldn't solve our relationship. They would always see me as a resource rather than a person, as long as I allowed financial need to override emotional respect. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to tell them about the lottery winning, but not in the way they might expect. Not as a reveal that would suddenly make me valuable to them, but as a test of whether they could love me when they believed I had needs and limitations. I would tell them I had won, but I would first see how they treated me when they thought I was just an elderly woman asking for basic human dignity without the power to command it through wealth. The plan I devised was elaborate but necessary. I would continue to maintain my boundaries around respect and inclusion, while gradually revealing that my financial situation had changed. I would give them opportunities to treat me better, without the motivation of personal benefit. I would test whether their love was genuine or merely transactional. But first, I needed to understand something about myself. Why was their approval still important to me after years of evidence that they didn't value me appropriately? Why was I still hoping for a relationship that they had shown no interest in building? Why was I still trying to earn love from people who seemed determined to withhold it? The answer, I realized, lay in the difference between love and attachment. I loved David because he was my son. because I had poured my life into raising him, because some bonds transcend behavior. But I was attached to the fantasy of the family I thought I had built. The illusion of reciprocal love I had convinced myself existed despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Loving David meant wanting the best for him, even if he never treated me well. Being attached to David meant needing him to validate my worth, even when he consistently failed to do so. Recognizing the difference between love and attachment would allow me to care for my family without sacrificing myself to their dysfunctions. This distinction would prove crucial in the weeks ahead, as my plan to test their capacity for genuine relationship unfolded in ways I never anticipated. The first phase of my test began with a simple invitation. I called David and asked if the family would like to join me for dinner at a nice restaurant in Manhattan, my treat. Not an expensive place, just somewhere pleasant where we could talk without the distractions of home environments. David seemed surprised by the invitation, but agreed readily, perhaps hoping that I was ready to return to our previous arrangements. We met at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and pictures of the old country on the walls. Emma and Michael were excited to be somewhere special, their energy bringing lightness to what I suspected would be a heavy conversation. Sarah was polite but distant, clearly wondering what agenda might be driving this unexpected grandmother generosity. I wanted to take you all somewhere nice because I have some news to share, I began once we had ordered our meals. The children perked up with curiosity, while David and Sarah exchanged glances that suggested they were bracing for announcement of illness or some other crisis. A few months ago, my financial situation changed in a way I never expected, I continued, watching their faces carefully. I came into some money, enough to be comfortable for the rest of my life. This was technically true, though dramatically understated. $28 million was considerably more than comfortable, but I wanted to see their reaction to modest good fortune before revealing the full extent of my windfall. David's response was immediate relief mixed with something that looked like calculation. Mom, that's wonderful. Was it an investment that paid off? Sarah leaned forward with interest, her earlier distance replaced by focused attention. Even the children seemed to understand that something significant was happening, though they returned to their breadsticks when the conversation continued in adult complexity. Something like that, I replied deliberately vaguely. The important thing is that I'm financially secure now. I won't need to worry about money for healthcare or housing or any of the basic necessities. I paused to let this information settle, watching as they processed what my improved circumstances might mean for them. That's such good news, Mom, David said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm so glad you don't have to worry anymore. And maybe now we can get back to normal with the family financial arrangements? There it was, the immediate assumption that my good fortune existed primarily to benefit them, that my security was valuable mainly as their safety net. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Eleanor, this is such a relief. I've felt terrible about the strain our situation has put on your retirement. Now we can all relax and focus on family relationships instead of money concerns. Her version of relaxation apparently involved the return of my unconditional financial support, with my actual comfort being secondary to their access to resources. Actually, I said carefully, my improved situation doesn't change my boundaries around financial independence. If anything, it makes me more determined to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial need. The disappointment that flashed across their faces was brief but unmistakable, replaced quickly by forced smiles and careful recalculation. The conversation continued through dinner, with both David and Sarah making subtle attempts to gauge the extent of my newfound security and the likelihood of renewed financial assistance. They complimented my recent independence, expressed admiration for my principled approach to boundaries, and suggested that perhaps we could find new ways to support each other, now that money wasn't a worry for anyone. But what I noticed most clearly was what they didn't do. They didn't ask how I was feeling about this change in circumstances. They didn't express curiosity about what this security meant for my dreams or plans. They didn't acknowledge the years of financial stress I had endured while supporting them. They didn't apologize for taking my sacrifices for granted or express gratitude for the support I had provided when I could barely afford it. Instead, they focused entirely on how my good fortune might benefit them, how my security might restore their access to my resources. Even in learning that I was no longer financially vulnerable, they seemed unable to see me as anything other than a potential source of support for their needs. The drive home through Queens that night was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts about what had been revealed and what remained hidden. I watched the familiar streets pass by my window, thinking about the strange ways that money changes relationships, not just when you need it, but when you have it. My lottery secret sat heavy in my chest, 27,900,000 additional reasons why I would never again need to accept disrespect in exchange for belonging. But I also felt the stirrings of something I hadn't expected, sadness that even modest financial security couldn't inspire my family to treat me better without the motivation of personal benefit. They loved what I could provide. They were learning to manage without what I could provide. But they had never learned to value who I was beyond my utility to them. 3 days after our restaurant dinner, Sarah called with a proposal that revealed how thoroughly she had misunderstood both my boundaries and my priorities. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about your improved financial situation, and I have an idea that might benefit everyone." Her voice carried the excitement of someone who believed she had solved a complex problem with elegant simplicity. "I'm listening," I replied, though I suspected I already knew the direction this conversation would take. "What if we found a way for you to invest in David's law practice? He's been wanting to expand, bring in a partner, maybe lease a bigger office space. With your new security, you could be a silent partner and help the family business grow while getting return on your investment. It would be a win-win situation." The proposal was delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed they were offering me a favor rather than asking for money. "Sarah, I appreciate the creative thinking," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But I'm not interested in mixing family relationships with business investments. David's practice is his responsibility, and my financial security is mine." The boundary was clear and immediate, but I could hear her determination regrouping on the other end of the line. "But Eleanor, this would be different from just giving us money. This would be a real partnership where everyone benefits. David gets the capital he needs, you get return on investment, and the family becomes more financially stable overall. It's not charity, it's smart business." Her reframing of the request as an opportunity rather than assistance was creative but transparent. "I understand how you see it," I replied. "But I've learned to keep family relationships and financial arrangements separate. They tend to complicate each other in ways that aren't healthy for anyone involved." This was perhaps the understatement of the year, given how their previous financial dependence had poisoned our relationship dynamics. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Sarah becoming increasingly frustrated as I maintained my position. She tried guilt. "David has worked so hard to build his practice." Logic. "This is just smart financial planning." And even subtle threats. "I hope this doesn't affect the children's relationship with their grandmother." But I held firm, recognizing each manipulation technique from years of experience with her methods of persuasion. When the call ended, I felt both proud of maintaining my boundaries and sad about the confirmation of Sarah's priorities. Even learning that I had achieved financial security hadn't inspired her to focus on our relationship rather than my resources. Her first instinct remained extracting benefit from my good fortune, rather than celebrating my improved circumstances. But the real test of my family's character came the following week, in a form I never saw coming. Emma, my 9-year-old granddaughter, called me on a Tuesday afternoon while walking home from school. Her small voice was excited and conspiratorial, as if she was sharing the most important secret in the world. "Grandma Eleanor, Mommy told me you have lots of money now, and I have an idea for something really special we could do together." My heart clenched at hearing that Sarah had discussed my financial situation with the children, turning my private information into family conversation without my consent. "What kind of special thing were you thinking, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep judgment out of my voice while mentally preparing for whatever seed Sarah had planted. "Well, you know how I've always wanted to go to Disney World? And now that you have money, maybe we could take a really big family trip there for Christmas. Mommy says it costs a lot, but maybe not for you anymore." The innocent excitement in her voice broke my heart, because I could see exactly how Sarah had manipulated the situation to make me the villain if I refused an expensive family vacation. "That does sound like a wonderful trip, Emma," I replied carefully. "But big family vacations are something parents usually plan and pay for themselves. Grandmas can help with special treats and smaller adventures." I was trying to explain adult financial boundaries to a child who had been coached to make a request that put me in an impossible position. "But Mommy says you could afford it easily now, and it would be so much fun for everyone. Michael wants to go too, and Daddy says Disney World is magical for families." Each statement revealed the coaching behind her call, the way my financial security had been presented to her as a solution to her parents' unwillingness to save for their own children's dreams. That evening, I called David to address what I saw as a serious boundary violation. "David, I need to discuss something concerning about my conversation with Emma today." My voice was calm but firm, the tone I had learned to use when addressing behavior that was unacceptable regardless of their intentions. "Oh, about Disney World?" he replied with a lightness that suggested he saw nothing problematic about their approach. "The kids are so excited about the possibility. Sarah thought it would be cute if they asked you directly, instead of us making it seem like a business transaction." The manipulation was presented as thoughtfulness, their coaching of the children reframed as protecting my feelings. Using the children to make financial requests is inappropriate, David, I said directly. Emma doesn't understand the complexity of family financial dynamics, and putting her in the position of asking for expensive things creates problems for everyone involved. I was fighting both the immediate manipulation and the precedent it would set for future requests. Mom, no one is using anyone, David replied, his tone becoming defensive. The kids love you and want to share experiences with you. If you can't afford Disney World, just say so. But don't make it sound like we're manipulating the children when they express genuine feelings. The deflection was masterful. My objection to their tactics became evidence of my own character flaws. This isn't about what I can or cannot afford, I responded, feeling anger rise in my chest. This is about appropriate ways to discuss family finances and appropriate ways to make requests. Using children as intermediaries for expensive requests is manipulation, regardless of how it's presented. The clarity of my position felt solid and unarguable, but I was learning that people determined to avoid responsibility could argue with anything. The conversation deteriorated from there, with David insisting that I was overreacting and misinterpreting their innocent family enthusiasm. Sarah got on the phone to express hurt that I would accuse them of coaching the children, suggesting that Emma's request came from her own excitement about our relationship rather than parental influence. The gaslighting was systematic and exhausting, leaving me questioning my own perceptions despite clear evidence of what had occurred. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about the profound sadness of having to protect myself from people I had spent my life supporting. The lottery ticket in my jewelry box represented freedom from financial vulnerability, but it couldn't protect me from emotional manipulation or the pain of seeing my own family treat me as a resource rather than a person. I decided it was time to end the experiment and reveal the full extent of my lottery winnings, but not in the way they expected. The next morning, I called a meeting with a family lawyer to discuss the best way to handle my windfall in the context of my deteriorating family relationships. Martha Chen had handled my will years ago, a competent woman in her 50s who understood the complexities of family wealth and inheritance. I trusted her discretion and valued her practical approach to emotional family dynamics. $28 million is a life-changing amount of money, Eleanor, Martha said after I explained the situation. And you're right to be concerned about how it might affect your family relationships, especially given the patterns you've described. She reviewed the notebook I had shared with her, my documentation of the 48 incidents of disrespect that had led me to establish boundaries. What I'm thinking, I continued, is setting up a trust structure that protects the money while allowing me to use it for genuine family needs and emergencies. But I want the terms to be clear. Respect and relationship first, financial benefit second. The idea had been forming in my mind for weeks, a way to use my windfall to potentially heal our relationships rather than further complicate them. Martha nodded thoughtfully. We can certainly design something like that. A family trust with behavioral conditions isn't uncommon, though it requires careful language to be enforceable. What specific behaviors would you want to incentivize or discourage? The question forced me to articulate what I needed from my family in concrete terms rather than emotional generalities. Over the following 2 hours, we outlined a trust structure that would provide financial support for genuine needs, medical emergencies, educational expenses, housing crises, while not rewarding manipulative behavior or enabling continued financial irresponsibility. The trust would include requirements for respectful communication, inclusion in family decisions, and acknowledgement of my contributions to the family over the years. I also want a provision that if they contest the terms or attempt to manipulate the system, their access is suspended. I added, thinking about Sarah's likely response to any structure that limited her control. This has to be about rebuilding relationships on healthy foundations, not just managing their access to money. Martha smiled approvingly. That's exactly the kind of wisdom that protects both the money and the family dynamics. Too often, sudden wealth destroys relationships because people don't establish clear boundaries from the beginning. Your approach is mature and thoughtful. Her reassurance felt validating after weeks of questioning my own judgment about family situations. The trust document took 3 weeks to draft and finalize, during which time my family continued their various attempts to access my supposed moderate financial improvement. David called regularly with small requests and casual mentions of business opportunities. Sarah sent text messages with links to family vacation deals and investment opportunities. Even the children were deployed for additional requests, though I had made it clear that using them as intermediaries was unacceptable. Finally, on a crisp October morning, I called David and asked him to arrange another family meeting at my apartment. I have something important to share with everyone, and I want to do it properly this time. My voice carried a weight that seemed to register with him, because he agreed immediately without his usual questions about the agenda. Sunday afternoon arrived gray and windy. Typical fall weather that matched my internal sense of approaching change. I had prepared carefully for this conversation, with the trust documents sitting on my dining table along with copies of my lottery ticket and the bank statements showing my $28 million balance. Everything they had been trying to access through manipulation was sitting in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. David arrived first with the children, who ran immediately to my living room to play with toys I kept specifically for their visits. Sarah came in 5 minutes later, carrying the slightly impatient energy of someone whose afternoon had been claimed for unknown family business. We settled around my dining table, the same seats as our previous confrontation, but this time I held all the power. 3 months ago, I bought a lottery ticket at Miguel's bodega, I began, placing the ticket on the table between us. I won the Mega Millions jackpot, $28 million after taxes. The silence that followed was complete except for the children's laughter from the next room, their innocent play providing a surreal soundtrack to the moment that would change everything. David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, calculation, excitement, before settling on something that looked like relief mixed with anticipation. Sarah's reaction was more dramatic, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the lottery ticket like it was radioactive. 28 million? She whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. Why didn't you tell us sooner? David asked, his voice carrying a mix of hurt and excitement. Mom, this changes everything. All the stress we've been under, all the financial pressure. You could have ended that months ago. The accusation was immediate and predictable. My failure to solve their problems had become my fault, regardless of how they had treated me. I didn't tell you because I needed to understand something first, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the emotional weight of this moment. I needed to know if you could love and respect me when you thought I was just your elderly mother with limited resources. I needed to see if our relationship could be genuine rather than transactional. Sarah's expression had hardened as the implications of my words sank in. You've been testing us? You let us struggle financially while you sat on millions of dollars just to prove some kind of point? Her anger was building quickly, the sweet mask finally slipping to reveal the resentment underneath. I let you take responsibility for your own lives while I learned to value myself appropriately, I corrected, meeting her gaze directly. You were never struggling. You were living beyond your means and expecting me to cover the difference. There's a significant distinction. The truth was harsh but necessary, a clear statement of the reality they had been avoiding for months. David looked confused and hurt, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of some uncomfortable truths about their behavior. Mom, I get that you were hurt by some things that happened, but keeping this secret while we stressed about money seems cruel. We're family. Family members help each other. His version of family help remained stubbornly one-directional, flowing from mother to son without reciprocal consideration. David, in the past year, you have asked me for money 14 times. In that same period, you have asked about my well-being twice. You have invited me to family gatherings 9 times, 7 of which were occasions when you needed childcare or financial help. That's not family helping family. That's adult children using their mother as a resource. The statistics from my notebook hit the room like physical blows, concrete evidence of patterns they couldn't deny. This was the moment I placed the trust documents on the table, the legal framework I had created to protect both the money and the possibility of genuine family relationships. I've established a family trust that will provide support for legitimate needs, medical emergencies, educational expenses, genuine crises. But it comes with conditions designed to ensure that we rebuild our relationships on foundations of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Sarah grabbed the documents immediately, scanning them with the intensity of someone looking for loopholes or escape clauses. Her face grew darker as she read the behavioral requirements, the respect clauses, the suspension provisions for manipulation attempts. This is controlling and manipulative, Eleanor. You're holding money over our heads to force us to behave the way you want. The irony of her accusation was stunning, coming from someone who had spent years manipulating me through guilt, obligation, and threats of exclusion. The trust requirements are simple, I replied calmly. Respectful communication, inclusion in family decisions that affect me, acknowledgement of my contributions over the years, and no use of the children as intermediaries for financial requests. If those seem like unreasonable demands, perhaps that illustrates the problem we need to address. Each requirement was basic human decency presented as revolutionary change, revealing how thoroughly they had abandoned appropriate treatment of me. David was still processing the magnitude of both the money and the conditions, his expressions cycling through confusion, resentment, and calculation. Mom, these conditions make it sound like you don't trust us. We're your family. We love you. Why can't you just help us because you want to, not because of some legal contract? His plea was emotionally compelling, but practically meaningless, given years of evidence that their love was conditional on my usefulness. I don't trust you, I said simply, the words landing in the room like stones in still water. 48 documented incidents of disrespect taught me not to trust you. Your immediate focus on accessing this money rather than celebrating my security taught me not to trust you. Your reaction to reasonable conditions taught me not to trust you. The honesty was brutal but liberating, finally saying out loud what years of experience had taught me. Sarah stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. This is insane. You're punishing us for not being perfect while you were secretly rich the entire time. You caused problems in our marriage by cutting off financial help when you could have afforded to maintain it. You put stress on the children by creating artificial scarcity. And now you want us to jump through hoops to access money that could have prevented months of unnecessary hardship. Her version of events painted me as the villain for having boundaries and them as victims of my reasonable self-protection. Sarah, at no point were you entitled to my money before or after the lottery. My voice remained calm despite the emotional intensity of her anger. Your financial hardship was caused by your financial choices, not my failure to subsidize them. The trust provides generous support for genuine needs while protecting against the manipulation and entitlement that damaged our relationships. Each statement was factual and unarguable, though I knew facts had little power against determined self-deception. The argument continued for another hour, with David trying to mediate between his wife's outrage and his mother's unyielding position. Sarah alternated between fury at the conditions and desperate attempts to negotiate them away. I remained firm, recognizing that this moment would determine whether the lottery winnings became a tool for healing our family or another source of dysfunction and resentment. Finally, as the afternoon light faded through my apartment windows, I made one final statement that would define our path forward. The trust is established and the conditions are non-negotiable. You can choose to meet the requirements and receive support for genuine needs, or you can choose to reject the structure and remain financially independent. What you cannot choose is unrestricted access to my money without any accountability for your behavior toward me. The ultimatum was clear and final, leaving no room for further negotiation or manipulation. David looked defeated, caught between his wife's demands and his recognition that I was offering them financial security with reasonable strings attached. Sarah looked furious but calculating, clearly running through scenarios for getting around the trust conditions. The children continued playing in the next room, blissfully unaware that their family dynamics had just shifted permanently. "We need time to think about this," David said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. "This isn't how I imagined this conversation going. I thought you would be excited to share good news with your family, not use it to lecture us about our behavior." Even now, even faced with unprecedented generosity hedged with basic respect requirements, his focus remained on what I wasn't giving rather than what I was offering. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made one final attempt at emotional manipulation that revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about power dynamics in our relationship. "Eleanor, I hope you realize that money can't buy family relationships. If you condition your love on our behavior, you're going to end up very alone and very bitter, regardless of how much money you have." The threat was clear. Comply with their demands, or lose access to the family you spent your life building. But for the first time in decades, the threat felt empty. The lottery ticket had given me something more valuable than $28 million. It had given me the security to choose relationships that enhanced my life, rather than diminished it. If they chose to walk away because I required basic human dignity, then they were revealing their true priorities in ways that no amount of money could obscure. After they left, I sat in my apartment feeling both exhausted and oddly peaceful. The children had hugged me goodbye with the same enthusiasm as always, their love uncomplicated by the adult dramas swirling around them. Emma whispered that she hoped I would still be her grandma no matter what happened with the grown-up stuff, and Michael pressed a drawing into my hands that showed stick figures of our family under a rainbow. Their innocence reminded me that not all love in this family was conditional or complicated. That night, I opened a bottle of wine, something I rarely did, and sat by my window watching the city lights sparkle across Queens. The lottery ticket sat on my coffee table, no longer a secret weapon, but a tool of liberation that had already accomplished its purpose. Whether or not my family chose to meet the trust requirements, I had learned to value myself appropriately and demand treatment that reflected that value. The phone calls started the next morning, though not from the family members I expected. David's sister Linda, my former sister-in-law who lived in California, called after apparently hearing about the situation through family gossip networks. Eleanor, I heard about your lottery win and the family trust situation. I wanted you to know that I think you're handling this exactly right. David and Sarah have taken advantage of your generosity for years, and it's about time someone set boundaries with them. Linda's support felt validating after months of self-doubt and family gaslighting. She shared observations about David and Sarah's behavior at family gatherings over the years, patterns she had noticed but never felt comfortable addressing directly. Sarah has always struck me as someone who saw family relationships as opportunities rather than connections, Linda said bluntly. And David has been enabling her by avoiding conflict rather than protecting his mother's feelings. Outside validation from someone who knew the family dynamics but wasn't financially invested in the outcome helped me recognize that my perceptions had been accurate all along. I wasn't the oversensitive, demanding mother that Sarah's narrative suggested. I was an elderly woman who had finally learned to require appropriate treatment from people who had been taking advantage of her generosity. But the most surprising call came from my neighbor Marjorie, who had been quietly observing my family interactions during their visits over the years. Eleanor, I hope it's not inappropriate for me to say this, but I've been worried about how your family treats you. I've heard some of the conversations in the hallway, seen how they leave you looking defeated after visits. Whatever you're doing to stand up for yourself, I'm proud of you. Marjorie's observation helped me understand that the dynamics I had been experiencing weren't subtle or imaginary. They had been visible to outside observers who cared about my well-being. The isolation I had felt was partially self-imposed, the result of shame about being treated poorly by people I loved, rather than recognition that their behavior was the source of the problem. 3 days after our confrontation, David called to request a private conversation without Sarah or the children present. His voice sounded tired and conflicted, carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to recognize uncomfortable truths about his marriage and his treatment of his mother. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in Astoria, neutral territory where we could speak openly without the emotional charge of family gathering spaces. David arrived looking older than his 38 years, stress lines etched around his eyes and gray threading through his dark hair. He ordered coffee with shaking hands and sat quietly for several minutes before beginning to speak. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said Sunday, about the 48 incidents and the patterns of disrespect. I pulled out my calendar and tried to remember our interactions over the past few years. He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he was just beginning to ask himself. I think you might be right about some things. I think I've been so focused on keeping peace in my marriage and managing our financial stress that I stopped paying attention to how Sarah talks to you. And I think I stopped treating you like a person with feelings and started treating you like a solution to our problems. The admission was painful to hear because it confirmed my worst fears about our relationship, while also offering the first glimpse of hope I had felt in months. David was beginning to see the dynamics that had been invisible to him while he was benefiting from them. But I also knew that recognition was just the first step in what would need to be a fundamental change in how he approached both his marriage and his relationship with me. David, thank you for that acknowledgement, I replied carefully. But awareness without behavioral change doesn't heal the damage that's been done. I need to see sustained effort to treat me with basic respect and consideration, not just apologies for past behavior. The trust requirements weren't punitive. They were protective, designed to prevent the restoration of unhealthy patterns under the guise of improved intentions. I understand that, he said, though his expression suggested he was still grappling with the implications of real change in his family dynamics. But Sarah feels like you're trying to control our marriage and our family decisions through financial pressure. She thinks the trust conditions are designed to break us up or make her look bad. His wife's interpretation of my boundaries as a tax on her revealed how thoroughly she misunderstood the purpose of the requirements. Sarah's feelings about the trust conditions are exactly why the trust conditions exist, I replied directly. Someone who interprets requirements for respectful behavior as controlling manipulation has already revealed their intentions toward me. Someone who sees boundaries as a tax has already demonstrated why boundaries are necessary. The logic was circular but clear. Their resistance to treating me well proved that legal protections were essential. David winced at the harsh accuracy of my assessment, recognizing the impossible position he was in between a wife who demanded unconditional access to resources and a mother who required basic human dignity in exchange for generosity. What am I supposed to do, Mom? I can't force Sarah to change her personality, but I also can't lose access to support that could transform our family's future. The kids' education, our mortgage, my practice expansion, your trust could solve every financial stress we have. You're supposed to decide what kind of man and father and son you want to be, I answered, feeling a mix of compassion and frustration for his predicament. You're supposed to choose whether you want relationships based on love and respect or transactions based on convenience and extraction. You're supposed to decide if your family's financial comfort is worth your mother's emotional well-being. The choice I was presenting him was stark, but necessary. He couldn't have both my money and my degradation. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with David wrestling aloud with decisions that would define the rest of his family relationships. He loved his wife, but was beginning to recognize her manipulative patterns. He wanted financial security, but was starting to understand its true cost. He valued his relationship with me, but had never been forced to choose it over easier options. By the time we parted that afternoon, David had made one commitment that felt significant. He would attend family counseling with Sarah to address the patterns that had damaged our relationship, and he would insist that her treatment of me be part of their therapeutic discussions. It wasn't a complete solution, but it represented the first time he had acknowledged that his marriage dynamics were affecting his relationship with me in ways that required active intervention. But the real test of David's commitment came sooner than either of us expected, in a form that revealed the true stakes of the changes I was requiring. Sarah called me 2 days later, her voice tight with barely controlled fury and something that sounded like desperation. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something about the position you're putting David in. His business is struggling because he can't focus on work while dealing with family drama. His health is suffering because of stress. The children are confused and upset because they sense tension, but don't understand why. You're destroying our family with these power games." The accusation was comprehensive and emotionally loaded, painting me as the source of problems that had existed long before I established boundaries. But it was also revealing in its focus. Sarah's concern was entirely about the consequences of my behavior for her family, with no acknowledgement of the consequences of their behavior for me. "Sarah, the family drama you're referring to is the natural result of addressing problems that have existed for years," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite the emotional violence of her attack. "David's business stress, health issues, and family tensions are not caused by my boundaries. They're caused by your family's financial management and relationship patterns. I'm offering solutions through the trust structure, not creating problems by requiring basic respect." "Basic respect?" she repeated, her voice rising with indignation. "You call financial blackmail basic respect? You call holding money over our heads to force behavioral changes basic respect? You call threatening to exclude us from financial support if we don't meet your arbitrary standards basic respect?" Each question was delivered with increasing anger, as if the intensity of her emotion could transform my reasonable requirements into unreasonable demands. "Sarah, I call requiring courtesy in conversation, inclusion in family decisions, and acknowledgement of my contributions basic respect," I replied firmly. "I call not using children as intermediaries for financial requests basic respect. I call expressing gratitude for assistance rather than treating it as entitlement basic respect. If those requirements seem like financial blackmail to you, then you've revealed exactly why legal protections are necessary." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Sarah alternating between emotional manipulation, logical arguments, and threats about the consequences of my intransigence on her marriage and children. She accused me of jealousy over her youth, resentment about her place in David's life, and competitiveness about the grandchildren's affection. Each accusation revealed more about her insecurities and worldview than about my motivations, but they were delivered with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed her interpretations. Finally, Sarah played what she clearly considered her strongest card. "Eleanor, if you don't drop these trust conditions and just help our family like a normal grandmother, I will make sure that David chooses between me and you. And I think we both know which choice he'll make. You can have your principles or you can have your son, but you can't have both." The ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged successfully, someone who had always managed to manipulate situations to her advantage through emotional pressure and strategic positioning. But it was also the mistake I had been waiting for, the moment when Sarah revealed her true intentions and methods so clearly that even David wouldn't be able to rationalize them away. "Sarah," I replied quietly, "thank you for making your position so clear. Please make sure David hears exactly what you just said to me. Make sure he understands that you're demanding he choose between his wife and his mother because his mother requires respectful treatment. Make sure he knows that you see basic human dignity as incompatible with your vision of family relationships." I hung up the phone before she could respond, but within an hour, my phone was ringing with a call from David. His voice was shaking with emotion, anger, confusion, disappointment, and something that might have been the beginning of clarity about the woman he had married. "Mom, Sarah told me about your conversation, but her version doesn't sound like something you would say. She claims you threatened to cut off all family contact if she doesn't submit to your control, but that doesn't sound like the trust conditions you explained to me. What actually happened?" The question revealed that Sarah had overplayed her hand, creating such an extreme version of events that David's natural skepticism was activated. I recounted the conversation accurately, including Sarah's ultimatum about choosing between his wife and his mother. David listened in silence, and I could hear his breathing deepen as the implications of Sarah's position became clear. His wife wasn't just resistant to treating me respectfully. She was actively demanding that he abandon our relationship rather than require appropriate behavior from her. She actually said, "I had to choose between you?" He asked finally, his voice small and hurt. "She actually tried to force me to cut off contact with my mother because you want to be treated with basic dignity?" The betrayal in his voice was palpable, the recognition that his wife was forcing him into an impossible position for her own convenience and control. "David, I recorded the conversation," I said quietly, having learned from years of experience that truth could be twisted and reality could be denied without concrete evidence. "You can listen to exactly what was said in her own words, without any interpretation or revision." The recording existed, a simple app on my phone that I had started using months ago when family conversations became too hostile and manipulative to trust to memory. That evening, David came to my apartment alone, looking hollow and defeated. I played the recording of Sarah's call, watching his face crumble as he heard his wife's voice delivering ultimatums and threats with casual cruelty. The woman he loved was revealed as someone willing to destroy his relationship with his mother, rather than treat his mother with basic courtesy. "I don't know what to do," he said when the recording ended, his head in his hands and his voice muffled by emotion. "I love Sarah, but I can't believe she would try to force me to choose like this. I love you, but she's my wife and the mother of my children. How do I navigate a situation where the two most important women in my life can't coexist?" The pain in his voice was genuine and heartbreaking, but it was also based on a false premise that needed to be corrected. "David, this isn't about two women who can't coexist," I said gently, placing my hand on his shoulder. "This is about one woman who refuses to treat another woman with basic respect, and another woman who refuses to accept disrespectful treatment any longer. Sarah and I could coexist beautifully if she were willing to be polite, inclusive, and grateful for support rather than demanding, manipulative, and entitled to resources." The distinction was crucial. I wasn't creating conflict with Sarah. I was refusing to absorb her hostility without response. We talked until late that night, with David slowly coming to terms with the reality that his wife's behavior toward me had been inappropriate for years and was now escalating to relationship-threatening extremes. He began to see that my boundaries weren't attacks on his marriage, but responses to attacks on my dignity. He started to understand that the trust conditions weren't designed to control his family, but to protect me from continued exploitation and disrespect. By the time David left that night, he had made a decision that surprised both of us. He would insist on marriage counseling focused specifically on Sarah's treatment of me, with the understanding that continued family relationships required her to meet the basic standards outlined in the trust. If she refused counseling or continued her campaign to eliminate me from their lives, he would have to seriously reconsider what kind of marriage he wanted to maintain. But Sarah's response to David's ultimatum revealed depths of manipulation and vindictiveness that none of us had anticipated, setting the stage for a final confrontation that would test every boundary I had established and every ounce of strength I had developed over the preceding months. The campaign began subtly, with Sarah enlisting the children in her efforts to pressure David into choosing her over me. Emma and Michael began asking why Daddy seemed sad all the time, why Mommy cried when she thought no one was watching, why Grandma Eleanor couldn't just be nicer so everyone could be happy. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and devastating, using innocent children as weapons in an adult conflict they couldn't possibly understand. David found himself torn between protecting his children from adult drama and protecting his mother from his wife's escalating hostility. Sarah began making veiled threats about taking the children away if he chose me over her, suggesting that his loyalty to his mother proved he wasn't committed to his marriage. She enlisted her own parents in the campaign, having them call David to express concern about his mother's controlling behavior and its impact on his marriage. Meanwhile, Sarah also launched a social media campaign designed to humiliate me publicly while generating sympathy for her position. Posts about elderly relatives who use money to control their families appeared on her Facebook page, along with share requests and comments that clearly described our situation without naming me directly. The violation of privacy was stunning, but the distortion of facts was even more damaging. According to Sarah's online narrative, I was a bitter old woman who had won money and was now using it to break up her marriage because I was jealous of her relationship with my son. She was the victim of financial manipulation, trying to protect her children from a grandmother who demanded worship in exchange for support. David was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his wife and children and fear of being cut off from his mother's money. The posts went viral within their social circle, generating dozens of comments from friends and acquaintances who didn't know the full story but were outraged on Sarah's behalf. Elderly people who use money as weapons are the worst. David needs to choose his wife and kids over his controlling mother. Sarah deserves a husband who will protect her from this kind of abuse. Each comment was a small dagger, public validation of a narrative that painted me as the villain in a story where I had been nothing but generous and patient for years. But Sarah's most devastating move was yet to come. 3 weeks after her social media campaign began, she called Child Protective Services with a report that I was using money to manipulate access to the grandchildren, creating an unsafe emotional environment that required intervention. The accusation was false but sophisticated, using language about emotional abuse and financial coercion that triggered automatic investigations. The CPS visit was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. A young social worker named Jessica arrived at my apartment with a clipboard and a mandate to assess whether I posed a risk to Emma and Michael's emotional well-being. She asked questions about my financial relationship with their parents, my expectations for family interactions, and my responses when those expectations weren't met. Mrs. Henderson, we've received reports that you're using money as a tool to control your grandchildren's parents and access to the children themselves, Jessica said, reading from her notes with the detached professionalism of someone who dealt with family dysfunction daily. Can you help me understand your perspective on these allegations? I explained the situation calmly and thoroughly, providing documentation of the respect requirements in the trust, recording of Sarah's threatening phone call, and my notebook detailing years of disrespectful treatment. Jessica listened carefully, asking follow-up questions that revealed her growing understanding that the situation was far more complex than the report had suggested. Mrs. Henderson, requiring respectful communication and appropriate boundaries doesn't constitute emotional abuse of children, Jessica said, after reviewing my evidence. In fact, your approach appears quite reasonable given the history you've documented. The person who made this report may have misunderstood legal family trust structures or misrepresented the situation to support their own agenda. The investigation was closed within a week, but the damage to my emotional well-being was severe. Sarah had been willing to involve child protection authorities in her campaign against me, risking her own children's stability to eliminate my influence in their lives. The level of vindictiveness was breathtaking, but it was also clarifying in ways that nothing else had been. David's reaction to Sarah's CPS report was the beginning of the end of his tolerance for her behavior. When he learned that she had accused his mother of child abuse to gain leverage in their family conflict, something fundamental shifted in his perception of the woman he had married. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said when he called to check on me after the investigation closed. "I had no idea Sarah was capable of something like this. Using the system to attack you crosses every line I didn't even know existed." But Sarah's final gambit was still to come, and it would test every ounce of strength and clarity I had gained over the months of learning to value myself appropriately. 2 days before Christmas, exactly 9 months after I had won the lottery and 8 months after I had started establishing boundaries with my family, Sarah appeared at my apartment door with Emma and Michael in tow. The children looked confused and uncomfortable, clutching overnight bags and looking to their mother for guidance about what was happening. "Eleanor, I need you to watch the children for a few days," Sarah announced, pushing past me into my apartment without waiting for invitation or consent. "David and I are having marriage problems because of your manipulation and control, and we need time to work things out without the children being exposed to adult conflict." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. She was using my love for the grandchildren to force me into childcare while simultaneously blaming me for the marriage problems I had not created. "Sarah, you can't just drop the children off without discussion or planning," I replied. But Emma and Michael had already begun exploring my apartment, their presence making it impossible to refuse their immediate needs, regardless of my feelings about their mother's tactics. "Where is David? Does he know you're bringing them here?" "David is at a hotel thinking about his priorities," Sarah replied, with a tightness around her eyes that suggested the marriage problems were more serious than she was admitting. "I told him that until he decides whether he's committed to his wife and children or his controlling mother, we need space to figure out our future." The ultimatum she had threatened months earlier was finally being implemented, with the children as collateral to ensure my cooperation. "I need to call David," I said, reaching for my phone. But Sarah stepped closer with an expression that was part desperation and part threat. "If you call David, I will tell him that you refused to help with the children during a family crisis," she said quietly, her voice carrying the promise of further manipulation and public humiliation. "I will make sure everyone knows that when your son's marriage was in trouble, his own mother chose her petty resentments over supporting the family she claims to love." The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had been planning this scenario for weeks. Emma tugged on my sleeve, her 9-year-old face creased with worry about the adult tensions swirling around her. "Grandma Eleanor, are you and Mommy fighting? Daddy seemed really sad this morning and Mommy was crying in her room. Are we going to stay here for Christmas?" The innocent questions broke my heart, because these children were being used as weapons in an adult conflict that would shape their understanding of family relationships for years to come. I looked at Sarah, seeing clearly for the first time the desperate, manipulative woman my son had married and the toxic environment she had created for everyone around her. I thought about the $28 million sitting in my bank account, the power to solve their financial problems instantly and restore temporary peace to this fractured family. I thought about the trust conditions I had established to protect myself from exactly this kind of manipulation. And then I made a decision that surprised even me. "Sarah, I will watch Emma and Michael tonight because they need stability and care right now," I said calmly, meeting her eyes directly. "But tomorrow morning, you will pick them up and we will have a final conversation about family relationships and appropriate behavior. This manipulation stops now, regardless of the consequences." The boundary was clear and non-negotiable, delivered with the quiet strength I had been building for months. Sarah's expression shifted from smugness to uncertainty as she realized that her latest gambit hadn't generated the desperate compliance she had expected. "What does that mean, Eleanor? What are you planning to do?" The nervousness in her voice suggested that she was beginning to understand that her tactics might have finally pushed me beyond the point of tolerance and patience. "It means that tomorrow we reach the end of this pattern," I replied, gathering Emma and Michael close to me in a protective gesture that felt both natural and necessary. "It means that you will finally face the consequences of treating people who love you as enemies to be defeated rather than family to be cherished." The promise carried the weight of months of accumulated resolve and the security of 28 million reasons to choose dignity over dysfunctional peace. That evening, as I tucked my grandchildren into the bed I kept made for their visits, Emma asked the question that had been haunting all of us for months. "Grandma Eleanor, why are grown-ups so mean to each other? Why can't everyone just be nice and love each other?" Her small voice carried the wisdom of innocence, the perspective that could see through adult complications to the simple truth underneath. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people forget how to be kind because they get scared or angry or confused," I replied, stroking her hair and thinking about the conversation that would determine everything tomorrow. "But the most important thing is that you and Michael never forget how to be kind, even when other people forget." The lesson I was teaching her was also the lesson I was finally learning for myself. Kindness doesn't mean accepting unkind treatment, and love doesn't require sacrificing your own worth. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, a December day that felt charged with the possibility of liberation or disaster. Sarah returned punctually at 9 o'clock, her expression guarded but still carrying traces of the smugness that had characterized her behavior throughout this crisis. She clearly expected to collect the children and continue her campaign to force David into choosing between his marriage and his mother. What she found instead was a woman who had spent the night making perhaps the most important decision of her life. "Sarah, please sit down," I said after Emma and Michael had gathered their overnight belongings and settled in my living room with coloring books and juice boxes. "We need to have a conversation that will determine how this family moves forward from here." My voice was calm, but carried a finality that seemed to register with her despite her determination to control the situation. "Eleanor, I don't have time for another one of your lectures," Sarah replied, but she sat down at my dining table with the wary attention of someone who sensed that the power dynamics had shifted in ways she didn't yet understand. "David is waiting for me to bring the children home so we can decide whether we're staying in New York or moving somewhere we can start fresh without all this family drama." "The family drama you're referring to is your systematic campaign to eliminate me from my son's life because I require respectful treatment," I said directly, placing a folder of documents on the table between us. "But you've made a crucial miscalculation about my priorities and my willingness to be manipulated through the children I love." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked at the folder, clearly wondering what new legal or financial weapon I might have developed to counter her latest attacks. "What is this, Eleanor? More trust paperwork? More conditions and requirements? More attempts to control our family through financial blackmail? This is documentation of every manipulation tactic you've used over the past 9 months, including recordings of threats, screenshots of social media posts, and copies of your false report to Child Protective Services," I replied, my voice remaining steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "But more importantly, this is my resignation from the exhausting job of trying to have a relationship with someone who sees me as an enemy rather than family." I opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper, placing it in front of Sarah with the careful precision of someone making a move that couldn't be undone. This is a formal renunciation of the family trust I established for David and the children. As of today, there is no longer any financial incentive for you to tolerate my presence or pretend to respect me. You are free to treat me exactly as badly as you want, because I will no longer be in a position to respond with anything other than loving distance. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions as she processed what I was saying: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of panic, as she realized that her entire campaign had been based on the assumption that I needed their approval more than they needed my money. You're giving up the trust? You're walking away from the chance to be part of your grandchildren's lives? That doesn't make sense, Eleanor. You fought so hard for respect and inclusion. Why would you surrender now? I'm not surrendering, Sarah, I replied, feeling a deep peace settle into my chest as I spoke the words that would free me from years of painful hope. I'm choosing my own well-being over a relationship that requires me to. I'm choosing dignity over access. I'm choosing to love my son and grandchildren from a distance rather than allowing you to use my love for them as a weapon. The folder contained one more document that I had spent weeks preparing with Martha Chen's help. A revised will that left the majority of my lottery winnings to charities focused on elderly adults who had been financially exploited by their families. David and the children would inherit enough for security and opportunity, but not enough to transform their lives or eliminate the natural consequences of their choices. Emma and Michael will receive educational trusts that activate when they turn 18, with provisions for genuine emergencies before then, I explained, opening to the relevant pages. David will inherit a modest amount when I pass away, enough to acknowledge our relationship, but not enough to solve problems he should solve himself. The rest goes to organizations that help seniors who have been manipulated and exploited by their own families. Sarah's reaction was immediate and volcanic, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the realization that her strategy had not only failed, but had spectacularly backfired. You're punishing innocent children because you don't like their mother. You're destroying your son's future because your feelings were hurt. This is exactly the bitter, controlling behavior that David needs to protect his family from. I'm ensuring that my grandchildren learn the value of money through earning rather than inheritance, and I'm protecting my resources from being used to enable continued disrespectful behavior, I corrected, remaining calm despite her emotional violence. David's future was never my responsibility to fund, and his children's character development will benefit from understanding that love and money are not the same thing. The argument continued for another hour, with Sarah alternating between fury, bargaining, and threats as she grappled with the complete reversal of power in our relationship. She accused me of selfishness, manipulation, and elderly bitterness. She threatened to ensure I never saw the grandchildren again. She promised that David would choose his marriage over his manipulative mother when he understood the true stakes. But her words had lost their power to wound me because I had finally understood the difference between love and attachment, between family and dysfunction, between generosity and enabling. Sarah could take the children away, and I would miss them terribly, but survive with my dignity intact. David could choose his marriage over our relationship, and I would mourn the loss but not regret the boundaries that precipitated it. When Sarah finally left that morning, taking Emma and Michael back to whatever battlefield her marriage had become, I sat in my apartment feeling simultaneously empty and full. Empty of the exhausting hope that had sustained me through years of poor treatment, but full of the quiet strength that comes from choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to sacrifice yourself. The phone calls started within hours of Sarah's departure, as she apparently shared the news of my betrayal with David, and began mobilizing every family connection and social media follower to pressure me into reconsidering. My phone rang constantly with calls from David, Sarah, extended family members, and even strangers who had been recruited into Sarah's campaign to paint me as a bitter old woman destroying an innocent family. David's first call was the most painful, his voice breaking as he tried to understand how we had reached this point of complete family disintegration. Mom, Sarah told me about the trust dissolution and the will changes. I can't believe you would punish the children because of problems with her. Those kids love you, and you're cutting them out of your life over adult disagreements that could be resolved with compromise and patience. David, I'm not cutting the children out of my life, I replied, my heart aching for the pain in his voice while remaining firm in my position. I'm removing financial incentives for their mother to use them as weapons against me. I'm ensuring that my relationship with them, if it continues, will be based on love rather than inheritance expectations. And I'm protecting myself from further manipulation campaigns that use my love for them as a vulnerability to exploit. But Mom, the education trust could pay for college, graduate school, maybe even help them start businesses or buy homes someday. You're taking away opportunities that could transform their entire futures over personality conflicts with Sarah. David's plea was emotionally compelling, appealing to my desire to give my grandchildren every advantage in life. David, Emma, and Michael will have the same opportunities as millions of other children whose grandparents aren't wealthy, I replied, recognizing the entitlement embedded in his argument. They have intelligent minds, loving parents who are capable of working and saving, and access to public education that can prepare them for anything they choose to pursue. What they don't need is the expectation that grandma's money will solve all their problems, or the message that inheritance is more valuable than character. The conversation revealed how deeply the promise of wealth had corrupted our family relationships, creating expectations and dependencies that had poisoned natural love with financial calculation. David couldn't see past the money I was withholding to recognize the dignity I was reclaiming. Sarah couldn't understand my boundaries because she had never needed to develop her own. The children were growing up in an environment where love and money had become dangerously intertwined. But the most surprising development came 3 days later, when Emma called me from her school during lunch recess. Her small voice was steady and serious, carrying the emotional intelligence that children sometimes develop in chaotic family environments. Grandma Eleanor, Mommy, and Daddy told me you don't want to be our family anymore because of money stuff. But I don't understand why grown-ups can't just apologize and hug and make up like kids do. Emma, sweetheart, I will always want to be your family, I replied, tears streaming down my face as I heard the confusion and sadness in her voice. Sometimes grown-ups need to protect themselves from being hurt, even by people they love. That doesn't mean the love goes away, but it might mean the way we show love has to change. I was trying to explain boundaries and self-preservation to a 9-year-old without criticizing her parents or burdening her with adult complexities she shouldn't have to carry. Could I still call you sometimes? And maybe visit when I'm older and can take the subway by myself? Emma's questions revealed that she understood more about the family dynamics than the adults had realized, and that she was already planning for a future where she could maintain relationships independent of her parents' conflicts. Emma, I would love nothing more than to hear from you whenever you want to call, I said, meaning every word with the full depth of my grandmother's heart. And when you're older, if you want to visit, my door will always be open to you. Sometimes family relationships look different than we expect, but that doesn't make them less real or less important. That conversation with Emma crystallized something crucial that I hadn't fully understood about my decision. I wasn't abandoning my grandchildren. I was modeling self-respect and appropriate boundaries for them. I was showing them that love doesn't require accepting abuse, that family relationships should enhance rather than diminish your worth, and that sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. Over the following weeks, as the immediate crisis settled into a new reality, I began to understand the true liberation that comes from choosing dignity over dysfunction. My days were quieter but more peaceful. My phone rang less frequently, but with calls from people who genuinely cared about my well-being rather than my resources. My apartment felt like a sanctuary rather than a staging area for family drama. Marjorie continued to check on me regularly, bringing soup and conversation that reminded me what healthy relationships felt like. Linda called from California to express admiration for my strength and to share that she had established similar boundaries with her own adult children after watching my struggle. Martha Chen updated my legal documents to reflect my new priorities and assured me that I had handled a difficult situation with wisdom and grace. But the most profound change was internal. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have chosen yourself when everyone else expected you to sacrifice yourself. For the first time in decades, I was living according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. I was spending my money on things that brought me joy rather than buying temporary peace with people who didn't value me. I was filling my time with activities that enriched my life rather than obligations that depleted my spirit. 3 months after dissolving the family trust, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during my years of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice. I booked a cruise to Alaska, something I had always wanted to do but never felt free to spend money on while my family needed financial support. The 2 weeks I spent watching glaciers and wildlife, meeting fellow travelers, and experiencing the vast beauty of the northern wilderness were a revelation of what life could feel like when lived for yourself rather than in service to other people's dysfunctions. On the cruise, I met a group of women who had similar stories of family financial exploitation and boundary-setting struggles. We formed friendships based on shared wisdom rather than shared genetics, creating the kind of chosen family that values each member's well-being rather than their utility. These women celebrated my strength rather than resenting my boundaries, supported my healing rather than demanding my sacrifice. 6 months after my confrontation with Sarah, David called with news that didn't surprise me, but did sadden me. He and Sarah were divorcing. The marriage couldn't survive the stress of financial independence combined with the revelation of Sarah's willingness to destroy family relationships to maintain control. David had finally seen his wife clearly during the custody negotiations, which revealed the full extent of her manipulative tactics and vindictive character. "Mom, I owe you an apology," David said during that call, his voice carrying the exhaustion and clarity that sometimes follow the end of toxic relationships. "You were right about Sarah's behavior, about the manipulation, about the way she was using the children as weapons. I couldn't see it while I was living in it, but the divorce proceedings have exposed patterns that go back years. She accused you of things she's been doing herself." The apology was meaningful but bittersweet, coming at the cost of his marriage and his children's family stability. I felt no satisfaction in being proven right about Sarah's character, only sadness that the family I had tried so hard to support had finally crumbled under the weight of its own dysfunction. "David, I'm sorry your marriage didn't work out," I replied honestly. Whatever problems existed between Sarah and me, I never wanted the children to lose their intact family. But I hope this experience teaches you something about the difference between love that requires you to diminish yourself and love that encourages you to flourish. The lesson was one I had learned at considerable cost, but it was also the wisdom that had finally set me free. David asked tentatively about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship now that Sarah was no longer creating conflicts between us. The question revealed his assumption that her absence would automatically restore our previous dynamic, but I had changed too fundamentally to return to patterns that had never served me well. "David, I love you and I want to have a relationship with you and the children," I said carefully. "But that relationship will need to be built on different foundations than before. I'm not the same person who absorbed disrespect to maintain family peace, and I'm not interested in resuming financial arrangements that created more problems than they solved." The boundary was loving but firm, an invitation to genuine relationship rather than renewed exploitation. As I hung up the phone that day, I realized that my lottery win had given me something far more valuable than $28 million. It had given me the security to discover my own worth, the clarity to see dysfunctional patterns that had been invisible while I was trapped in them, and the strength to choose relationships that enhanced rather than diminished my life. Today, 1 year after winning the lottery and 8 months after dissolving the family trust, I sit in my Queens apartment watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold and rose. The $28 million sits in various investment accounts, growing steadily and funding charitable causes that support senior citizens who have been exploited by their families. The money that once represented the power to solve everyone's problems has become the foundation for helping strangers who face similar struggles. Emma calls me once a week, usually when she's walking home from school, sharing stories about her friends and her classes and her dreams for the future. Our conversations are precious precisely because they happen despite the family dysfunction, rather than because of any financial incentive. She is learning to maintain relationships based on love rather than obligation, a lesson that will serve her throughout her life. Michael is too young to fully understand what happened to our family, but he sends me drawings through David's supervised visits. Pictures of rainbows and houses and stick figure families that include a grandmother who lives far away but loves him very much. His innocence is a gift that reminds me why protecting children from adult toxicity is worth whatever temporary pain it causes. David and I meet for lunch once a month at a neutral location, slowly rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. He is learning to value my wisdom and experience rather than just my resource availability. I am learning to love him without enabling his poor decisions or accepting responsibility for problems he created. The process is slow and sometimes painful, but it is genuine in ways our previous relationship never was. Sarah has moved on to other relationships and other attempts to find security through manipulation rather than self-development. I occasionally hear updates through family networks, stories that confirm my assessment of her character, while also generating sadness for the life she might have lived if she had chosen growth over control. I feel no anger toward her anymore, just the detached compassion one might feel for a stranger struggling with demons that make genuine love impossible. The money that once seemed like the answer to all my family's problems turned out to be most valuable as a tool for revealing their true characters and my own worth. The lottery ticket that sat hidden in my jewelry box for months became the key that unlocked a cage I had been building around myself for years, bars made of obligation and guilt, and the desperate hope that sacrifice could purchase genuine love. Looking back now, I can see that the 48 moments of disrespect I documented in my notebook were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a family system that had learned to use love as currency and guilt as control. Breaking free from that system required not just financial independence, but emotional courage, the willingness to risk loneliness if the alternative was continued degradation. The woman who bought that lottery ticket 9 months ago was exhausted from decades of trying to earn a place in her own family through constant giving. The woman who types this story today understands that her place was never dependent on what she could provide, but on who she was, and that family members who couldn't love her without exploiting her were not truly family at all. If you are listening to this story and recognizing patterns in your own life, I want you to know that it is never too late to choose yourself. It is never too late to require appropriate treatment from people who claim to love you. It is never too late to discover that your worth is not conditional on your usefulness to others. The lottery gave me $28 million, but boundaries gave me something far more valuable: the knowledge that I deserve relationships that enhance rather than diminish my life, and the strength to walk away from anything less. Have you ever experienced something similar in your own family relationships? Have you found yourself wondering whether love should require such sacrifice, or whether family bonds should feel so exhausting? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me continue sharing these difficult truths that too many of us carry alone. Because sometimes the most important lottery win is not the money that changes your bank account, but the clarity that changes your life.